The story didn't start with military glory or strategic brilliance. It began with a man, a dusty workshop, and a truck that nobody thought was worth a dime. In the middle of the Great Depression, the idea of building something revolutionary out of scrap seemed almost absurd. And yet, that's exactly how a design that was dismissed as worthless would one day become the beating heart of one of the most critical wartime operations in modern history. The Red Ball Express, the lifeline of the Allied advance across Europe. Imagine the sound of wrenches clanging on steel, the smell of oil and grit, and a mechanic stubbornly refusing to throw away a dream. That mechanic, who wasn't an engineer, a general, or a politician, worked with the kind of precision born not from textbooks but from years of fixing broken machines. He didn't build for applause, he built for function. And function, as history would prove, was exactly what would win the war. To understand why this worthless truck design mattered so much, you need to picture Europe in 1944. The Allies had stormed ashore at Normandy, breaking the Nazi grip on France. But the victories in the fields of Normandy and beyond weren't just the result of bravery and strategy. They were powered, literally, by logistics. Armies don't just march on courage. They march on fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food. And as the front lines raced eastward, the supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Every mile forward meant another mile of gasoline, bullets, and bread that had to follow. Rail lines were destroyed or captured. Ports were overwhelmed. Air transport was limited. That left only one way to feed the war machine: wheels on the ground. But the roads of France weren't smooth highways. They were bomb-scarred, narrow, unpredictable, often little more than muddy farm paths. The trucks they needed had to be simple, rugged, and nearly indestructible. They couldn't afford breakdowns every few miles. Enter the design nobody wanted. Years earlier, in a quiet workshop, that mechanic had pieced together a truck with parts salvaged from other vehicles. His focus was on making something tough, something that could be fixed anywhere, with whatever was at hand. He built it without flash, just clean lines, a straightforward chassis, a reliable engine, and parts that could be swapped out in minutes. It wasn't sleek, but it was strong. And strength was exactly what the war would demand. Military officials at first ignored this kind of design. They were more interested in complex engineering, fast vehicles, or machines that could impress on a parade ground. But war doesn't care about appearances. War punishes over-engineering and rewards what works in the mud. As Allied commanders scrambled to find a way to keep their advancing divisions supplied, they rediscovered these rugged trucks, designs based on a mechanic's practicality rather than a company's ego. The Red Ball Express wasn't a planned masterpiece. It was born out of necessity, desperation, and a spark of brilliance. In August 1944, when supply lines nearly snapped under the pressure of success, American logisticians put together a bold plan around the clock truck convoy system that would rush supplies from the Normandy beaches straight to the front lines. Thousands of trucks would thunder down marked routes in an endless loop, like arteries carrying blood to the beating heart of the war effort. But to make it work, they needed trucks that could endure punishing distances, rough terrain, and brutal schedules. And here's where the worthless design became priceless. The trucks based on that mechanic's simple, tough blueprint, trucks that could be repaired in the field with basic tools, that didn't require delicate parts or specialized equipment, became the backbone of the Red Ball Express. Convoys roared through the French countryside, kicking up clouds of dust and mud, running day and night without rest. The drivers, many of them young African-American soldiers, faced constant danger, from German aircraft, sabotaged roads, and fatigue that could kill as surely as a bullet. But their trucks, those stripped-down workhorses, kept going. When something broke, they fixed it on the roadside. When a tire shredded, they swapped it out in minutes. When an engine coughed and died, they brought it back to life with whatever was lying around. This wasn't just about moving supplies. It was about outsmarting an enemy by out-moving them. The Germans didn't expect an army to sustain an advance at such a blistering pace. They counted on logistical exhaustion. But the Red Ball Express smashed through those expectations, and behind its success wasn't just strategy or bravery. It was the quiet genius of a truck design made by someone who had no idea he'd one day help change the course of a war. The irony was almost poetic. What the experts had called worthless turned out to be the most valuable asset of all. Because war, in the end, isn't won by the glamorous machines. It's won by the workhorses that keep going when everything else breaks. And as the convoys surged forward, something else happened. Something less tangible, but just as powerful. Morale soared. Soldiers at the front lines knew they weren't alone. They knew, No matter how far they pushed, the Red Ball trucks would find them, their engines roaring through the night. Every box of ammunition, every can of fuel, every meal kept the momentum alive. If the front line was the sword, the Red Ball Express was the arm that swung it, and the truck design that made it all possible was forged not in a factory boardroom, but in a greasy little shop by a man who believed in making things that lasted. That's the hidden truth of great turning points. Sometimes, it's not the leaders with stars on their shoulders who change history. Sometimes, it's the mechanic who refuses to throw away an idea. The story of how this forgotten design became a lifeline for one of the most daring logistics operations in history isn't just a tale of machines. It's a reminder that what's underestimated today can become indispensable tomorrow. As the war raged on and the Red Ball Express grew to thousands of trucks, moving thousands of tons of supplies daily, the world began to realize that logistics was the silent hero of the Allied advance, and at the center of it all was the truck that nobody wanted, now the most trusted partner on the road to victory. If you stood on the side of a Red Ball route in late summer 1944, you wouldn't just see trucks, you'd feel them. The ground would tremble as convoys rolled by, headlights off at night, engines growling like an unstoppable river of steel and determination. The dust they kicked up hung in the air for hours, clinging to uniforms, faces, and the pages of history. This was more than transportation. It was the raw, beating pulse of victory in motion. At first, no one believed the plan would work. Military planners were skeptical. A truck convoy system to feed an entire army? That's madness, they said. But desperation forces innovation. The Allied advance had been so fast after breaking out of Normandy that their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Tanks were running low on fuel. Artillery units were counting shells. Even frontline infantry began rationing ammunition and rations. Victory had created a dangerous problem: speed. And without a solution, that speed would stall. That's when the humble truck, built from a design no one had wanted to champion, became the solution nobody could afford to ignore. These weren't sleek armored vehicles or finely tuned machines. They were ugly, boxy. Some of them looked like they had already lived 3 lifetimes before arriving in France. But their simplicity was their power. When they broke, they could be fixed in minutes. When they hit potholes the size of craters, they kept moving. They were built for abuse, and war gave them plenty of it. The Red Ball Express was organized with military precision, but fueled by human grit. Drivers were assigned in shifts that often stretched far beyond the limits of exhaustion. Some slept only a few hours between convoys, their hands still shaking from gripping the wheel for hundreds of miles. They drove through blackouts, storms, and ambush zones, with signs along the way reading, Red Ball wrote, "Priority traffic only." Nothing else was allowed on those roads. Not tanks, not jeeps, just trucks in a relentless flow. And here's where the mechanic's original idea proved its genius. His design had focused on accessibility, making every part of the truck easy to reach and replace. On the Red Ball Express, that meant a convoy could fix itself. One truck's engine seized. The crew didn't wait for a tow. They stripped it down right on the roadside, swapped parts with another truck, and got it moving again. Some trucks limped to the front lines, missing fenders, doors, even windshields. But they got there. Each load mattered. Each truck carried something that could make or break the advance. Fuel drums strapped down with rope, ammunition crates piled to the brim, spare Tidios, food, and medical supplies. Every driver knew that what they hauled might be the difference between a victory and a stalled offensive. And when they looked in the mirror, what they saw behind them wasn't just another truck. It was a convoy, dozens of vehicles, each connected by a shared purpose. But the story of the Red Ball Express wasn't just mechanical. It was deeply human. Nearly 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers who, despite segregation and discrimination, became the backbone of this operation. They weren't celebrated like fighter aces or tank commanders. They didn't make headlines, but they kept the war alive with every mile. Their determination turned those worthless trucks into unstoppable symbols of resilience. Imagine one of those drivers, young, tired, barely 20. He grips the wheel of a rattling truck at 3 a.m. Rain slashes across the windshield. The headlights are blacked out, so he drives by the faint glow of the truck ahead, trusting that its taillights won't vanish into the darkness. Behind him, hundreds of gallons of fuel, volatile, dangerous, necessary. He can't afford a mistake. A single wrong turn, a single breakdown at the wrong moment, could ripple down the entire line. And yet, because he knows if he stops, the front stops. The roads were dangerous. Enemy aircraft prowled overhead, strafing convoys when they could. Roads were mined or sabotaged. Bridges were unstable. The trucks were not armored. A single bullet or shell could turn a fuel truck into a fireball. But what's astonishing is how few convoys turned back. Even when a truck went down, another took its place. The line never broke. That's how reliable the design was. That's how relentless the drivers were. And when the convoy reached the front, the reception was electric. Soldiers on the line cheered as the trucks arrived, their beds piled high with the lifeblood of the war effort. Some men ran to unload fuel cans themselves, desperate to refuel their tanks. Others helped pass along ammunition like a bucket brigade. Every arrival felt like a victory in itself. And for many of the drivers, seeing those faces, exhausted but grateful, was worth more than any medal. As the Red Ball Express grew, its operations became a legend in logistics. At its peak, nearly 6,000 trucks were on the move at once, carrying over 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. That kind of movement was unprecedented. But it was only possible because the trucks themselves were simple, tough, and endlessly adaptable. If those vehicles had been built to impress rather than endure, the operation would have failed. The military brass eventually realized what they'd dismissed was, in fact, a masterpiece of practicality. Worthless. Design had turned into the backbone of an entire strategy. It wasn't the truck that looked good on paper. It was the one that refused to quit in the mud. But beyond the numbers and mechanics was something even more powerful: trust. The soldiers at the front trusted that when they needed food, fuel, or bullets, the Red Ball trucks would come. The drivers trusted their machines. The mechanics trusted their tools. And in war, trust is as critical as strategy. Every convoy that thundered down those dusty roads was a message: we're still moving forward. The enemy couldn't see the strategy meetings or the supply calculations, but they could see, and hear, the endless growl of trucks bringing an army closer and closer to victory. The trucks became more than machines. They became symbols. Their dented hoods and grease-streaked frames told a story of resilience, of a design born in obscurity and elevated by necessity. They were living proof that greatness doesn't always wear a uniform or come with a title. Sometimes greatness is built with a wrench and a stubborn refusal to give up. By late September 1944, the Red Ball Express had already proven itself indispensable. And yet, what made it work wasn't just military organization. It was the quiet genius of a design once thrown aside, resurrected in the hour of greatest need. A mechanic's forgotten truck had become the spine of a rolling miracle. By the fall of 1944, the thunder of the Red Ball Express had become part of the rhythm of war. Soldiers at the front learned to recognize the distant hum of engines before they even saw the trucks. It was the sound of hope, of momentum, of a promise kept. And at the center of it all remained that worthless design. A truck built by a man who could never have imagined how far his stubborn creation would travel. The success of the Red Ball Express forced even the highest levels of military command to rethink how they viewed logistics. In the early days, supply had always been the quiet background player, the thing that happened while the real glory went to tanks, bombers, and generals with maps. But this operation made it undeniable: no matter how brilliant your strategy, without fuel, without bullets, without food, your army doesn't move. And without a machine that can endure the weight of war, your supply line breaks. The brilliance of the truck's design wasn't in complexity. It was in stripping away everything unnecessary. No delicate components that needed specialized attention. No fancy gadgets that could freeze in the cold or jam in the mud. Just strength, a sturdy frame, an engine that ran like a heartbeat, a body that could be stripped down and rebuilt with whatever a soldier had on hand. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't impressive. But it worked, and that made it extraordinary. By then, the drivers had formed an unspoken bond with their machines. Every rattle and groan became familiar, like the voice of a friend. They gave their trucks names, painted slogans on the sides, carved their identities into steel and mud. To outsiders, they were just vehicles. To the men who drove them through black nights and endless storms, they were partners. And those partners never let them down. The routes stretched hundreds of miles, often under conditions that would make any ordinary vehicle fall apart in a day. Potholes deep enough to swallow tires, bridges hastily rebuilt after bombing runs, roads slick with mud or coated with freezing rain, but still the convoys moved. If a truck couldn't climb a hill, others pushed it. If an engine died, the driver and his buddies fixed it on the spot. If the brakes screamed, they adjusted them with tools carried in their pockets. This wasn't a polished operation. It was grit and ingenuity held together with bolts, rope, and determination. And the mechanic who once built that first truck back home, he never stood on a battlefield. He never wore medals or commanded troops. But his design, copied, adapted, and produced by the thousands, was there in every mile of that miracle on wheels. His kind of vision doesn't make headlines, but it shapes them. In fact, the Red Ball Express became so efficient that it stunned even seasoned commanders. Supplies that once took days to move were now arriving in hours. Tanks that would have sat idle on the battlefield roared back to life within a day. Artillery that might have fallen silent kept firing without pause. This wasn't just keeping pace with the war. It was setting the pace. The German forces couldn't believe how fast the Allies were moving. They had planned their defense on the assumption that logistics would slow the enemy down. Instead, the Red Ball Express became a weapon in itself. The operation was far from glamorous. Drivers slept on the side of the road, ate cold rations behind the wheel, and often worked under fire. They didn't get parades or front-page glory. But ask any soldier at the front who the real heroes were, and they'd point down the road to the endless line of trucks. If they stop, they'd say, "We stop." And then there was the sheer scale. Every single day, more than 900 truck companies worked the route. Nearly 75% of the men driving them were African-American soldiers, men who served their country with extraordinary courage, even while facing discrimination in their own ranks. They didn't have equal recognition, but they carried the war on their shoulders. Their story is inseparable from the Red Ball Express. Their grit, like the mechanic's vision, made the impossible possible. Each truck was a moving story, a testament to teamwork, innovation, and relentless willpower. Soldiers joked that the trucks didn't need gas, they ran on stubbornness. And maybe in a way they did. Because those trucks weren't just steel and engines. They were proof of what happens when practicality triumphs over perfectionism, when something built to last finally gets its chance to shine. As the Allies pushed deeper into France through Belgium toward Germany, the Red Ball Express adapted. Routes were shifted, convoys rerouted, bridges rebuilt faster than they could be blown up. The operation became a living, breathing organism, flexible, fast, unbreakable. And it was all anchored by the same simple principle the mechanic had embraced years earlier. Make something that works, not something that impresses. Eventually, other supply lines took over. Rail lines were repaired, new ports opened. The Red Ball Express slowed, then finally stopped. But its legacy never did. Military leaders studied the operation for decades afterward, calling it one of the greatest feats of wartime logistics in modern history. The lessons were clear. Sometimes, the simplest tools are the most powerful. And sometimes, the most overlooked people, the mechanic, the driver, the soldier in the shadows, are the ones who win wars. That truck, born out of scrap and stubbornness, became more than a machine. It became a symbol of what real strength looks like, not polished perfection, but relentless function. It proved that when the world underestimates you, you can still build something unstoppable. And it whispered a truth that echoes far beyond the battlefields of Europe. Innovation doesn't always wear a suit or sit in an office. Sometimes, it wears oil-stained overalls. The men who drove those trucks often said the same thing. We didn't fight with rifles. We fought with wheels. And they were right. Those wheels carried more than supplies. They carried the hope of an army, the momentum of liberation, and the stubborn determination of people who refused to be ignored. Even today, historians look back and marvel at how an operation thrown together out of necessity, built on a design once mocked and discarded, became a cornerstone of Allied victory. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't clean. But it worked, mile after muddy mile. And because it worked, the world changed. Some heroes are remembered in statues and medals. Others live on in the rumble of an engine, the squeal of worn tires, the steady clank of gears. The Red Ball Express was powered by both, the visible courage of its drivers and the invisible genius of a forgotten mechanic. When the last convoy rolled, when the roads finally fell silent, the soldiers who had depended on those trucks didn't forget. They knew that behind every mile of their advance, behind every victory that followed, there had been a lifeline of steel and grit. A lifeline born not from glory, but from grit, grease, and a stubborn refusal to quit. And in that quiet truth lies the real heartbeat of history. Sometimes, the greatest revolutions don't start in war rooms or halls of power. Sometimes they start with one person, a set of tools, and a vision that everyone else is too blind to see.